Hi everybody, I'm Mrs. Sarah Ryan and this is Psychology from my classroom. We are still in my classroom. Oh, hang on a second. There we go. I couldn't get my screen to work. Alright, we are still in my classroom and we are talking about Unit 7, Memory and Cognition in AP Psychology. In our last couple of lessons, we've been talking about kind of that process of getting information into our brain, that processing, what's known as encoding. Today we're actually talking about like how memory gets stored and how that process is going to work. And what many people refer to in talking about memories is they talk about short-term memory versus long-term memory. So that's kind of our topic for today, short-term versus long-term. So first of all, if we are talking about short-term memory, know that it is literally short-term. Okay, we are talking like a few fleeting seconds. Okay, this is momentary pieces of information. And so short-term memory really has two major types in what we call iconic memory and echoic memory. Iconic memory is going to be momentary sensory information of a visual stimulus. And so this is like that flash of something that you would see. That would be iconic memory, that it is a short-term visual piece of information. And on the flip side of that then, we have echoic memory, which is a momentary sensory memory of something that I would hear, something that is auditory. And so even if my attention is somewhere else, that sounds especially, a little bit more so than what I'm seeing, I can still recall those things. Like they're still there because they're in that short-term memory of something that has just literally entered into my brain. And so iconic memory would be something that I just saw, and echoic memory is something that I just heard. And that again, with hearing, I tend to do slightly better than what it is that I see. But again, these are fleeting, momentary pieces of information. Like that is really what short-term memory is talking about. Now, research on short-term memory and like how does short-term memory work, how much information is going to be in my short-term memory, actually has a handy-dandy little catchphrase, and that's the magical number 7 plus or minus 2. Now, this isn't a hard or fast rule. Like we know that sometimes, especially if I'm paying attention, that there might be more that I could have in my short-term memory. But if you're talking about like an experiment of fleeting pieces of information, you are likely going to remember somewhere between 5 and 9 bits. Okay, so 5 to 9 pieces of information, either things that you saw or things that you heard, you would likely be able to recall immediately back somewhere around 7, right? An average of 7. So somewhere between 5 pieces of information and 9 pieces of information. And again, we do this much better with things that I am hearing as opposed to things that I am seeing. So if I were to read out a list of words, that you'd probably remember more, like closer to the 9 end of me reading a list of words, as opposed to, excuse me, you seeing a list of words. That would be a difference there. Now, psychologists aren't super huge fans of the idea of just short-term memory and long-term memory because it makes it sound like short-term pieces of information just magically become part of my long-term memory, and that's couldn't be further from the truth. That short-term information is literally those few momentary seconds, that if something is going to become a long-term memory, you have to do something with it. And that's where psychologists often talk about working memory. Working memory is indicating that in order to transform this fleeting piece of sensory information into an actual memory that I'm going to be able to recall, some later date and time that I have to do something with it. I have to think about it. I have to practice with it. Like, I have to work with this memory in order for it to actually become a long-term memory. And this is where the role of the hippocampus really comes into play. So when we studied the different parts of the brain, we talked about how the area of the limbic system known as the hippocampus is responsible for determining what pieces of information are going to go on and become a memory versus something that is not. But you have to activate the hippocampus in order to get this to actually work. And so if I wanted to take this piece of information and make it into a long-term memory, I have to replay the events in my mind, I have to talk about them, I have to think about them over and over again. Like, that's how I'm actually going to work with that information in order for it to actually become a long-term memory that I can recall later on down the line. So the idea that it's just, short-term memory, long-term memory really is kind of a misnomer, because you have to do something with information in order for it to really be something that I store in long-term memory. So then one of the greatest, oh, there go my lights in my classroom. Yay, not moving around enough. There we go. So one of the greatest mysteries in psychology, and something that we've really been very curious about for a long time, is where are memories stored? And what's the physical process of creating memory? Because obviously, we have this biological system in our brains. Everything psychological is simultaneously biological. What is then the biological process of taking this information and making it into a memory? How is that really going to work? So first of all, what we've been able to determine is that there is not one single place in the brain in which memories are stored. So like when we talked about the different parts of the brain in Unit 3, we talked about like a primary auditory cortex or your sensory cortex for your sense of touch, things like that, that there isn't like a memory cortex, okay? Instead, what we've been able to determine is that memories are stored in the place of the brain in which it was processed. So wherever that piece of information is processed in the brain, that is also where the memory of it is stored in the brain. And this actually helps us to understand how brain injury can affect memory in different ways, that there are different kinds of memory that people would potentially lose and others they wouldn't, that we've actually been able to do a fairly good job at finding out that this memory trace, right, tracing where is it that memories are getting stored in the brain, that they're being stored in the part of the brain that processed that information. Which still doesn't help explain to us what is the physical process of creating a memory. And that's where something called long-term potentiation, or LTP, comes in. LTP is the physical strengthening of neuronal connections in the brain. And there's actually time-elapsed videos online where you can see this, where you can see the individual neurons making the connections between each other. And when two neurons are utilized together in tandem over and over and over again, the connection between that sending neuron's axon terminal and the receiving neuron's dendrite, that the more frequently that they get used, the more seamless that process becomes, and it's an easier process. And that's the strengthening of that connection that we're talking about here. And so what we found is that long-term potentiation is going to tell us this physical strengthening is taking place, and that's the physical process of creating memories in the brain. And so that's how these pathways, these neuronal pathways get created, where neurons that are used over and over and over again, and they've been connected to the one next to them over and over and over again, that strengthening process is what's going to physically create the memory in the mind. And so the whole adage about either you use it or you lose it is incredibly true when it comes to the physical process of creating memories in your brain. That if that's not something that you regularly think about, the memory of it is simply going to go away. And it might seem really odd when I say things like, I don't really remember a whole lot about high school, and people might make jokes about me not really paying attention, but high school for me was 20 years ago. And I don't sit and think about my high school life from 20 years ago very frequently. And so there's little pieces of it left in my brain, but so much so gets lost because I don't keep thinking about it over again. And the same is true about like different skills. Now, I know that when I was in high school, I was an okay kind of a student, right? I did fine. But like when students start talking about their calculus homework and things like that, I nod my head and I smile. But it's been a really long time since I've done that, and I really don't remember it. And it's not like I did bad when I was in high school. Like, I mean, I got it when I was in high school, but that's not something that I chose to do with my life. And so the physical memory that was once created about those topics has gone away. And in its place, information that I did utilize over and over and over again, and that I still do today, that's what's physically being strengthened. And so that's how long-term memory is physically going to work in your brain. And if you don't use it, you do lose it. And in fact, side note on this, the process of where, like, if I'm not using those neurons, that the connections go away, it's actually referred to as synaptic pruning. And we see this as a good thing because this is making our brains more efficient in whatever it is, the skills and abilities and things like that I'm going to develop as I age. Like, that is actually a very good thing. So the fact that I don't necessarily remember how to do calculus because that's not something that I did with my life, it doesn't devalue that as a subject. Math is important. But I mean, that's actually what's making my brain the better kind of brain that it can be as a woman who's in her 30s, as opposed to somebody who's just always has these little bits of information left behind. Now, there is an exception to all of this, and it's something known as a flashbulb memory. So flashbulb memories are going to be clear memories of emotionally significant events, okay, or emotionally significant moments that have ever happened in your life, and that you remember them with real striking clarity. And one of the reasons why you remember them with such striking clarity is because of their emotional significance. That when you had strong emotional connection to the event that's taking place, one, you're increasing your stress hormones, and you're also going to be more likely activating your amygdala. And so this process is going to make more glucose available in the brain, which is the sugar, of course, that your brain runs on. And so the brain actually recognizes, like, this is really important. This is something that I should be remembering. And so, I make the comment about how, I don't remember a whole lot about being in high school because, again, it was 20 years ago. But I can tell you that I was a senior in high school on September 11th, 2001. And I can tell you that I watched the second plane hit the Twin Tower when I was sitting in my third period. It was a law class, and then I remember watching that on the TV, and that I walked over to my next class. It was fourth period, and it was American Culture Studies, and that we watched it some more. And the next day, my photography teacher took us outside. We were to look at the sky because it was the only time that we were never going to see an airplane flying. I mean, there was a real significant element about, having this major terrorist attack that happened while I was in high school. And so I have very clear memories of that emotionally significant event. And you likely will too when there's something that's really drastic that happens in your life, that you can have this stunning clarity of those events because of that emotion. And so that's referred to as a flashbulb memory. So last thing for today then, talking about implicit and explicit memory as well as our different types of amnesia. So Implicit and explicit memory actually helps us to understand some of the different kinds of amnesia that can take place in a person. So amnesia is going to be a sudden loss of memory. And this is typically going to take place because of some kind of traumatic brain injury that takes place. So we know that the loss of memory is very significant. It can be very debilitating because memories are part of who we are. It's part of our own self-identity, and when they're lost, it's a really significant element for us. So first of all, we know that when brain injury happens, that very typically a person will not remember the immediate events leading up to the brain injury, as well as the events immediately after the brain injury. That things can be real fuzzy and stuff like that going on, which is kind of the opposite of what we were just talking about with like those flashbulb memories, where you're talking, traumatic brain injury, that's going to be something that's emotionally significant. You would think you would remember things very clearly, but there is very likely kind of like this haze around the event. And that's because immediately prior to the event, you never had the opportunity to create any kind of memory trace, any kind of long-term potentiation because of the injury that happened, and so that's why that piece of information is missing. After the brain injury, then there's usually a real lack of focus and attention that can take place, so that's where I'm missing out on those kinds of memories. And so when traumatic brain injury happens, there's usually this kind of hazy element that has occurred around the injury. Now, the other thing that can happen is differences in what's known as retrograde versus anterograde amnesia. Retrograde amnesia is the kind of amnesia that you see in like movies and soap operas and things like that on TV shows, where a person, they have a brain injury and they like forget who they are. They don't remember their name, they don't remember where they're from. It's like they don't have any kind of recollection of things in the past, okay? And so in retrograde amnesia, what can happen then is that the memories can come back as the brain is healing itself. And so that doesn't always happen. It's very much dependent on how much brain injury has taken place. But that's really what retrograde amnesia is talking about. And that's actually not a super common thing for that to happen, even though that's what we see in a lot of our movies and TV shows. Instead, what can happen is anterograde amnesia, and anterograde amnesia is really, really, really significant in that this is a person who is not able to create new memories, and so not being able to create new memory is where the person is always in just the present moment. They would be able to remember things prior to their brain injury, but anything beyond their brain injury is lost. There is no creation of new memory. It would be difficult to know who people are if, as they've aged, that they become unrecognizable. That is what happens in anterograde amnesia. There is actually documentaries done about a really famous anterograde amnesia patient named Clive Wearing out of England that I highly recommend seeing, because it's very sad and it's very significant as to how much this role of memory really plays in your life. Retrograde amnesia and anterograde amnesia also highlight for us different types of memory that we create in what's known as implicit memory versus explicit memory. Implicit memories are procedural memories. These are memories of skills and preferences, and the vast majority of these are going to be stored in your cerebellum. And so a procedural memory would be a memory of like, I remember how to tie my shoes, and I remember how to ride my bike, and I remember how to do a step shuffle ball change because I used to do tap when I was a little kid. Like, those are procedural memories, and procedural memories actually are very strong. right? The whole adage about like how you never forget how to ride a bike, like, you know, it's like riding a bike, you just get back on it and you know how to do it. Like, that's an implicit memory. That is a procedural memory, and they are stored in the cerebellum, and they can be very, very strong. And so damage to the cerebellum, of course, means that I can lose my procedural memories. But then damage to other parts of the brain might mean that those implicit memories are still intact, and that, you know, I would still hang on to those. So this is different than an explicit memory, which is a declarative memory. Declarative memory, these are memories of things that I can declare, or facts and experiences that I can declare that I know. So like I can remember my social security number, and I can remember my address, and I can remember my phone number from when I was a little kid growing up. That, you know, these are facts, these are figures, these are things that I can declare that I remember and I know. And so that's going to be memory that is stored throughout my cerebral cortex. And so again, damage to the cerebral cortex would mean that I could lose some of my explicit memories, but not my implicit memories. Damage to my cerebellum, I can lose my implicit memories, but not my explicit memories. This is also going to help explain something that we refer to as infantile amnesia. It is very well documented that young children do not remember, like, being born, for example, and that most people often can identify somewhere around the age of 3 as their first memory, and, you know, whatever their first memory might be. But there are procedures that we learned when we were little kids. Like, you learned how to use a toilet, and you learned how to tie your shoes or how to get dressed and things like that. And you probably don't remember learning those events. I mean, you might, right? But you probably don't. And yet you can still do them. And so this whole like dual processing of the fact that, you know, we have implicit and explicit memories helps explain why, like, young children, they're able to maintain these implicit memories in their cerebellum all the way from, you know, the start of birth, as opposed to that declarative memory that would be found in the cerebral cortex. And this again goes back to like how the brain develops, and the cerebellum is something that's going to develop, you know, prior to the cerebral cortex, because it's an older structure in the brain, and so it's better equipped for those procedural kinds of memories and being able to remember them. So until next time, we'll talk about, well, memory, obviously. Until then, thanks for joining me.